The year had barely begun when the sky over the Eastern Front closed like a heavy door. The wind, which had previously seemed merely cold, now tore at the skin, as if carrying invisible blades. Each gust cut the faces of the German soldiers, turning their cheeks into red, stiff and painful flesh. At the start of the campaign, victory seemed inevitable. The Blitzkrieg, the German war machine, had swept across borders like an unstoppable thunderbolt, crushing cities and armies in weeks. But there, before the immense white void of Russia, that confidence began to crumble. Nature has become the enemy. No gunshots, no explosions, just cold. A cold that silently ripped away life. The thermometers dropped so quickly they seemed to escape from the glass bottom. 40 degrees below zero. No coat was big enough to protect a man from this. In the morning, soldiers would wake up with frozen mustaches, boots as stiff as stones, and fingers that barely responded. Some tried to move their hands, but it was like controlling dead claws gripping their wrists. The Russian enemy seemed to have vanished, plunged into a white mist. But the real executioner was already there. Winter. Engines that once roared like mechanical beasts now coughed weakly and stalled. The oil inside them turned into thick, almost solid pastes. Tanks, which had been the pride of the Wehrmacht, had been transformed into useless monuments of frozen metal. Trucks were getting stuck in the deep snow. The gears rattled like broken bones. Railways were breaking apart under sudden thermal contractions, cracking as if the earth was screaming. The Blitzkrieg, swift, brutal, overwhelming, died there, suffocated, buried under layers and layers of endless snow. Speed turned into slowness. Progress has turned into a daily struggle for survival, and the silent dread began to spread. The veterans whispered through gritted teeth, "We don't have clothes for that. Not even the whole of Germany can defeat the Russian." Winter, and for the first time, many soldiers felt a fear that no bullet had ever caused. The feeling that they were no longer fighting against men, but against a force of nature that wanted to destroy them. Initially, Moscow was just a dot on the map, a distant flag that Hitler vowed to capture before the year was out. But now, there, before the invisible walls of the Soviet capital, the German army discovered that victory could be a cruel mirage. The front seemed endless. Men who had marched confidently for thousands of kilometers now staggered like shadows, wrapped in rags that had once been called uniforms. The brilliance of Prussian discipline had vanished, swallowed by fatigue, hunger, and snow. Each step in the deep snow drained strength from their legs, and the frozen air scraped their lungs from the inside, as if they were drawing in handfuls of ice instead of oxygen. The city they were supposed to conquer was still there, huge, dark, unreachable. It seemed to mock them, hidden behind snowflakes as dense as curtains. The faces of the German soldiers told stories without words. Some had cuts on their cheeks, open wounds from the frostbite. Others lost fingers without even realizing it. First the pain, then the numbness, and finally the icy silence of dead flesh. It was common to see a man take off his glove and let out a muffled cry when he realized that his index finger no longer bent, and that it was turning black, hardened, doomed. The once proud Wehrmacht now resembled an army of military beggars. The boots made for marching in Europe couldn't withstand the hardened Russian soil. Soles cracked, leather disintegrated, and many soldiers wrapped their feet in rags, trying to keep their blood circulating. But it was no use. The cold simply didn't care. Moscow was beginning to look not like a military target, but like a magical barrier, something the Germans could see, but never touch. The worst part was psychological. The men knew they were so close, and yet so impossibly far away. Deep-set eyes, empty stares. Hope, once the fuel of the German march, evaporated in the frozen air. There wasn't enough shelter. The tents were turning into rickety, dilapidated structures, and the few fires they managed to light released dark smoke, which the wind blew away in seconds. Around the makeshift campfires, the scene resembled a frozen nightmare, men trembling uncontrollably, teeth chattering like macabre castanets as they tried to get through the night without sleeping, because sleeping too much in that cold meant never waking up again. The weapons, which were supposed to protect their lives, were now turning against their owners. Rifles jammed, metal froze the skin to the touch, grenades didn't work. It was common to see soldiers banging their rifle butts on the ground, begging the weapon to obey. And yet, the order echoed across the white fields. "We haven't backed down yet. Moscow is right next door." The problem was that nobody believed it anymore. For the first time since the Second World War had begun, the German war machine was showing signs of irreversible wear and tear. For the first time, the men who believed they were marching toward triumph began to feel that they were marching toward oblivion. Just a few kilometers from the Soviet capital, the Wehrmacht discovered a brutal truth. Winning battles isn't enough. You have to survive the journey to get there. While the Germans froze before the gates of Moscow, far behind them, away from the trenches and the distant roar of artillery, another gigantic force began to move, not made of steel or tanks, but of people. In the heart of the Soviet Union, Stalin raised his voice like thunder. The message was not just a speech, it was an order, a desperate plea, and a deadly challenge. The entire nation would fight, or Russia would cease to exist. Radios crackled through the ruined cities, carrying the leader's words to darkened factories, lost villages in the countryside, destroyed towns, and homes where families mourned those who had already departed. Men and women stopped what they were doing, hammers suspended in the air, shovels resting on the ground. Children with frightened eyes pressed against the walls and listened. The enemy was at the gates, and there was no one on the left or right who wasn't now a soldier. Within days, what remained of the adult male population was called to arms. Immense lines formed outside recruitment centers, men trembling not only from the cold, but from fear and responsibility. Many came without understanding what a war truly entailed. Peasants torn from their villages, workers leaving behind still warm machines, and students who had barely become teenagers. The order was clear: Moscow would not fall. Not today, not ever. And so, an entire army was reborn. Trains began arriving in the capital carrying troops, sometimes with rifles, other times only with the raw courage of necessity. Overcrowded wagons crossed desolate landscapes where burned villages still spun with smoke, and frozen fields hid scars from previous battles. Inside the train cars, the atmosphere was a mixture of tense silence and anticipation. Some men were trying to sharpen bayonets and clean old weapons hastily brought from forgotten depots. Others held photographs, wondering if they would ever see loved ones again. Many slept on top of ammunition boxes, as if the train ride were the last moment of peace they would have. They weren't professional soldiers. They were citizens who suddenly became the country's last line of defense. And they didn't come alone. Women, the elderly, and even children took up the rearguard with fierce determination. Factories operated non-stop. Workers sweated in freezing sheds, producing tanks, ammunition, and makeshift winter clothing. The entire nation has become a machine driven by resistance, fear, and revenge. While the Germans froze within reach of Moscow, the Red Army swelled like a river of thawing spring ice. New divisions were formed, new commanders emerged, and each arriving train carried with it more than soldiers. It brought hope. Because at that critical moment, Stalin understood something simple, yet gigantic. Russia could lose cities, fields, and millions of lives, but it could not lose the will to fight. And so, while the wind howled through the streets of Moscow and cannons thundered in the distance, an entire nation rose from the ashes and snow, ready to strike back. When the new soldiers began arriving at the gates of Moscow, it was no glorious parade. There was no time for waving flags or rehearsed speeches. The entire city was a war camp, icy, silent, and determined. There, Soviet officers scurried to and fro, like carpenters trying to repair a ship damaged by a storm. Each newly arrived unit needed to be positioned somewhere in the defense, each rifle distributed, each bullet counted as gold. The Red Army, which weeks before had seemed on the verge of collapse, was now transforming before the eyes of the world. It was a desperate but also brilliant reorganization. Experienced commanders, many of them veterans of the Russian Civil War, resumed their posts. Forced by circumstances, Stalin allowed more talented and less submissive generals to return to command. Men like Zhukov, who knew how to fight with coldness and strategy, and who knew the enemy better than anyone. These leaders reshaped everything: defensive positions, supply, lines, retreat routes, and counterattack points. There was no more room for improvisation. Every meter of land around Moscow was now part of a plan. Meanwhile, the soldiers received basic instruction hastily, often in snow-covered courtyards or in the corridors of public buildings converted into barracks. There, an exhausted veteran tried to teach a boy who had never held a rifle how to disassemble and clean a weapon that could jam at any second because of the ice. And it wasn't just the technique that needed training, it was the mind. Every man who wore the uniform needed to understand that Moscow was not just a city, it was memory, it was pride, it was the heart of an entire country. From a logistical standpoint, the transformation was equally brutal. Old trucks, creaking like dying creatures, carried ammunition through the city. Women sewed makeshift coats from wool, leather, and even animal hides, anything to keep the deadly cold from devouring more soldiers than bullets. Heavy artillery was dragged into defensive positions, buried under mounds of snow for camouflage. Mosin Nagant rifles, simple yet resistant to freezing, were distributed as an extension of the Russian will itself. And for every weapon, there was a man willing to use it. The Red Army was no longer a disorganized mass running backward. It was becoming a wall, and not just a static wall, but a wall that breathed, learned, and moved. The troops that had previously only retreated were now training for the opposite, to advance, attack, and crush. The reorganization also brought something the Germans never imagined they would face: absolute resilience. While the Wehrmacht lost strength with each passing day of cold weather, Soviet resistance seemed to gain vigor precisely because of it. It was as if the ice nourished the spirits of men, reminding them that this was their land. The snow was the enemy, but it was a familiar enemy. When the operational plan finally took shape, something new shone beneath the white mantle of Moscow. There were no more desperate eyes or empty expressions. Now, soldiers settled into their makeshift uniforms with a silent flame burning within their chests. They knew the counterattack would come, and when it arrived, it wouldn't be small, it wouldn't be shy, it wouldn't be defensive. It would be the fierce response of a country that refused to be erased from the planet. The German machine was freezing. The Soviet woman, fueled by winter, was beginning to awaken. Operation Typhoon, the grand final assault aimed at taking Moscow, had begun with a roar, a furious march of tanks, trucks, and entire divisions advancing relentlessly, crushing everything in their path. Hitler envisioned a swift, devastating blow, like those that had brought down Poland, France, and much of Europe. But in that vast, white expanse of Russia, the static roar turned into a deadly silence. As winter tightened its grip, the operation that should have been a steely feat turned into a giant bogged down in ice. The narrow, once firm roads were now treacherous trails covered in meters of snow. Every kilometer traveled was fraught with danger: unseen ambushes, vehicles stuck in the mud, and the worst enemy of all, the frozen wilderness. The German engines struggled to start. Panzer tanks, the pride of the Blitzkrieg, roared like wounded animals before simply shutting down. Without proper heaters, the fuel thickened and turned into a pasty mass. Soldiers tore open ammunition boxes to light fires and tried to use the heat of the flames to revive the engines, often without success. Horses froze to death along the way, motionless like ice statues, with long clouds of vapor escaping from their nostrils until they could escape no more. Trucks piled up on the roads, not out of strategy, but because they broke down and could never be restarted. The entire Wehrmacht seemed to be mechanically seizing up, gear by gear, soldier by soldier. And as if the cold wasn't enough, hunger began to creep in. Supplies were running low. Bread was a luxury. Meat was rare. Many soldiers chewed snow to stave off thirst, even knowing that this robbed their bodies of even more heat. While the German army battled against time, the weather, and fate itself, the Red Army, well equipped with woolen clothing and lined boots, watched from afar and waited for the right moment. The conditions were so harsh that the sound of the weapons themselves turned against the men. The rifles froze and wouldn't fire. Metal stuck to the skin, tearing off chunks of it when touched without gloves. Gunners tried to clear them with warm breezes, but the icy air only made things worse. And a silent horror hung over the mind of every soldier. The enemy was no longer the Soviet army. It was the land itself. A German officer wrote in a desperate letter, "We have the capital ahead of us, but between us and it lies winter. And he has more soldiers than Stalin." Operation Typhoon, which was supposed to end the war in the east, has stalled, not for lack of courage nor for lack of leadership, but because nature finally chose its side. And he didn't choose Germany. When the German maps were revised and the reports reached the high command, the reality hit everyone like a bucket of ice water. There was no further progress possible. Every meter gained cost more lives than any general was willing to admit. While the Germans were merely fighting to stay on their feet, the Soviets were preparing for something far greater, a brutal, calculated, and inevitable response. At that exact moment, the wind changed, and the course of the war began to change with him. So, when it seemed that Moscow would be swallowed up by German shadows and cannons, the impossible happened. In the midst of a cruel cold that cracked rocks and made the air burn in their noses, the Red Army decided it was time to do what no European army had ever accomplished before, not only to resist the German invader, but to push him back. It was the beginning of December 1941. The sun barely appeared in the sky, and when it did, it was just a pale smudge shrouded in mist. The ground was so hard it felt like iron, but the Soviets, prepared and determined, broke the white silence. Suddenly, the frozen calm of the snow-covered fields was broken by an immense, guttural and unmistakable sound. Artillery. Soviet cannons, many of them camouflaged under piles of snow or hidden in dark woods, roared together like thunder from underground. The rumble echoed across the entire front, a cloudless thunder charged with purpose. The Germans, exhausted, hungry and frozen, heard and immediately understood what it meant. Russia was counterattacking. Grenades exploded on the ice, sending up columns of snow, mud and mutilated bodies. Frozen barbed wire was ripped from the ground as if it was straw. Abandoned houses used as shelters were reduced to pieces of wood flying in the wind. And then, when the last piece of artillery ceased, when the echo of the explosion still trembled in the icy air, they came. Soviet troops advanced like a human tide of red and white, red for the army, white for the snow that covered their overcoats and hats. Some units glided on skis, moving like swift, silent ghosts across the frozen surface. Others came on foot, marching with fixed bayonets, narrowed eyes, and breath turned into hot smoke that vanished in the wind. It was a shocking sight for the Germans, because up until that moment, the Wehrmacht saw itself as the hammer, and the Soviets the passive anvil. But on that day, the roles were brutally reversed. German positions that seemed solid crumbled like rotten walls. Lacking ammunition, fuel, and morale, many units were unable to even mount a defense. Others tried to fight with desperate courage, but were crushed by the immense weight of the seemingly endless Soviet human waves. The surprise was total. The German command simply did not believe that the Russians still had the strength to fight, much less to attack. But the winter, which had mercilessly punished the Wehrmacht, had preserved the defenders of the land, as if the cold were a secret ally. Dinner was absolute chaos. Soviet T-34 tanks, better suited to ice, emerged through the fog like steel demons. Groups of skiers surrounded German platoons before they could react, and each Soviet advance was accompanied by a cry that pierced the wind, sometimes in Russian, sometimes in silence, but always carrying the same message: you've come too far. The Wehrmacht wasn't just facing soldiers, it was facing an enraged country, an entire nation that had finally stopped retreating and decided to strike back. The Red Counterattack had begun, and it would continue to grow, blow after blow, until it rewrote the course of the war. Ah, what a stark contrast unfolded across the vast snowy fields surrounding Moscow in the merciless winter of 1941. When the Soviet counterattack erupted like a primordial storm, sweeping across the horizon with a fury that seemed to echo from the far reaches of Siberia to the frozen plains of central Russia. It was a scene straight from the abyss of human history, where the fate of nations was decided not only by military strategies or sophisticated weaponry, but by the raw, inexorable reality of the human body, pushed to its absolute limit. On one side, the newly mobilized Soviet troops, an army reborn from the depths of the vast Soviet empire, arrived. Like inexorable waves of the ocean, brimming with primal vigor, fueled by the collective rage of a people who saw their motherland desecrated by foreign invaders. These men and women, yes, for the Red Army incorporated everyone in its desperate defense, came from remote regions. The robust Uralians, accustomed to the biting cold of the mountains. The Siberians, forged in the tundras, where the thermometer plunged beyond 40 degrees below zero. The workers from the factories of Sverdlovsk and Novosibirsk, who had left the still warm assembly lines to take up arms. They traveled in crowded trains, crossing thousands of kilometers of frozen tracks under the cover of night to avoid Luftwaffe bombers, carrying with them not only freshly oiled Mosin Nagant rifles and T-34 tanks straight from the production lines, but a fierce determination, inflamed by Stalinist propaganda that portrayed them as defenders of Rodina, the sacred homeland threatened by the Nazi horde. Imagine them, descending from the wagons, wearing quilted sheepskin coats, shaggy Valenki boots that insulated their feet from the treacherous ice, and stomachs full of black bread, cabbage soup, and vodka distributed to warm their blood. Their eyes, not yet clouded by the prolonged horror of the front, gleamed with a patriotic fire, fueled by stories of German atrocities, burned villages, shot civilians, raped women, that spread like poison through Soviet communication lines. They marched with firm, compact steps, in formations that echoed the discipline newly instilled in the accelerated training camps, where generals like Zhukov and Rokossovsky had orchestrated the mass mobilization, calling up reserves numbering in the hundreds of thousands, including Siberian divisions transferred from the Far East after confirmation that Japan would not attack. These newly arrived soldiers carried abundant ammunition, grenades that exploded with lethal precision, and even skis to traverse the deep snow, transforming hostile terrain into an ally. Their morale was high, fueled by the belief that the Great Patriotic War was a crusade against absolute evil, and that every meter reclaimed was a step toward the salvation of humanity. On the other side, oh, the human tragedy embodied in the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, those once invincible conquerors of Europe, now reduced to trembling shadows, walking spectres on battlefields that seemed to have emerged from a Dantean inferno. They had been there since June 1941, when Operation Barbarossa had erupted with the force of a hurricane, promising a swift victory over the Soviet colossus with feet of clay. But months of incessant fighting, forced marches through choking dust in the summer and sticky mud in the autumn, had taken an unimaginable toll. Now, in the heart of the Russian winter, General Winter, as the Germans themselves called it in terrified whispers, they faced not only the enemy, but the total collapse of body and soul. Their uniforms, designed for the temperate climates of Western Europe, were inadequate for the Siberian cold. Thin coats torn from constant use, leather boots that absorbed moisture and froze their feet, leading to horrific gangrene where entire toes rotted and fell off like dead leaves. Many soldiers suffered from frostbite, with blackened noses and ears, cracked skin that bled at the slightest touch, and bloodshot eyes that barely blinked in the biting wind. Exhaustion was an invisible monster that devoured them from within. Days without decent food, rations reduced to crumbs of stale bread, and frozen canned meat that had to be melted over makeshift fires, if firewood was available at all. Sleep, a forgotten luxury, they huddled in shallow holes dug in the snow known as trench igloos, where the cold pierced their bones like needles, and sleep was interrupted by sentries shouting warnings of night attacks. Diseases raged, dysentery that left them weak and dehydrated, pneumonia that turned breaths into agonizing coughs, and lice that infested every fold of clothing, spreading typhus and unbearable itching. Morale shattered. Letters from home arrived late or never, bringing news of Allied bombing raids on Germany, and Nazi propaganda, which promised imminent victory, now sounded like a cruel joke. Men who had marched triumphantly through Paris and Warsaw now trembled not only from the cold, but from a primal fear, the fear that the end was near, that the vast Russian continent would swallow them alive. When Soviet forces attacked, the contrast became a living nightmare, a macabre dance between vitality and decrepitude. The Soviets advanced in coordinated waves with heavy artillery like the Katyushas, Stalin's organs, howling in the sky like demons, launching rockets that exploded in cascades of fire and shrapnel, pulverizing German positions. Their T-34 tanks, with sloped armor that deflected German bullets as if they were rain, roared through the snow, crushing makeshift barricades. The Red Army soldiers shouted "Hooray!" in unison, a cry that echoed like thunder, instilling terror in German hearts. In hand-to-hand combat, it was pure brutality. Soviet bayonets, sharpened and wielded with renewed force, pierced German coats, finding frozen flesh that tore with horrifying ease. Clenched fists, kicking boots, gnashing teeth in fights where survival dictated the rules. The exhausted Germans responded with rifles that jammed in the cold, MG-42 machine guns, that failed due to a lack of lubricating oil suitable for the ice, and grenades that slipped from numb hands. Terror settled in like a frigid fog. German soldiers, watching their comrades fall beside them, rigid bodies freezing instantly in the snow, glazed eyes fixed on the grey sky, felt despair corroding their souls. "Mein Gott, wir sind verloren," some whispered. "My God, we are lost," as they stumbled back, leaving trails of blood and abandoned equipment. Hopelessness was palpable. Dreams of Nazi glory evaporated like smoke, replaced by visions of slow death from hunger, cold, or enemy bullets. Officers, once authoritarian, now pleaded for resistance, but their voices trembled, echoing empty in the wind. In villages like Klin or Istra, recaptured by the Soviets in December 1941, Germans fled in panic, abandoning 88mm cannons, Opel trucks stuck in the snow, and even wounded men who cried out for help but were left behind so as not to delay the retreat. The battlefield had become an open-air cemetery, German corpses contorted in grotesque poses, covered by a thin layer of ice that preserved them like macabre relics, serving as a warning to those who came after. This clash was not merely a military confrontation, it was an allegory of human hubris, where the German arrogance of an invincible Blitzkrieg collided with the infinite resilience of the Soviet people. The Siberian warriors adapted to the cold. Many wore white camouflage over their uniforms, becoming ghosts in the snow, flanked German positions, cutting already tenuous supply lines. German trucks without winter tires spun uselessly, while draft horses died of exhaustion, their bodies serving as makeshift barricades. Fear turned to pure terror when, at night, Soviet patrols infiltrated the lines, beheading sleeping sentries, leaving bloody messages in the snow. "Welcome to Russia, fascists." Despair deepened with each lost meter, each fallen comrade, each order from Hitler, the "not to retreat an inch," issued on December 18th, 1941, which sounded like a death sentence. The Germans, exhausted to the core, saw on the horizon not victory, but annihilation, a white void that swallowed everything. And so, the front shifted. The hunters became the hunted, pursued by a seemingly inexhaustible enemy. The Soviets, with their fresh divisions, like the 316th Rifle Division, commanded by Panfilov, whose men heroically defended the approaches to Moscow, promised endless retaliation, fueled by the memory of besieged Leningrad and fallen Kiev. German terror was total, dreams tormented by visions of Siberian gulags, distant families, and the certainty that the Russian winter did not forgive the weak. On this infernal stage, history was written in blood and ice, marking the beginning of the end for the Nazi illusion of dominance. As the Soviet counterattack gained momentum, transforming the snowy fields into a vortex of chaos and carnage, the Wehrmacht, that war machine that had crushed France in weeks, swept through Poland like a deadly breeze and subjugated entire nations with surgical precision, began to crumble, not with a dramatic bang, but with an agonizing creak, like a steel colossus rusting under the weight of its own boundless ambition. It was the winter of 1941-1942, and the Eastern Front, stretching over 1,000 kilometers of frozen forests, icy rivers and endless plains, revealed the deep fissures in the heart of the German army. What had begun as a triumphant offensive, with panzer divisions roaring forward and infantry marching in flawless columns, was now transforming into a symphony of despair, where each note was a muffled cry, each chord a lost position, and the inevitable crescendo was the total collapse of morale and structure. Initially, the signs were subtle, almost imperceptible amidst the roar of battle, communications failing due to cables severed by ice or sabotaged by Soviet partisans, who emerged from the shadows like vengeful specters, cutting telephone lines and ambushing lone messengers. Units like Hoepner's 4th Panzer Army, overstretched in their attempt to encircle Moscow, lost contact with high command in Smolensk, leaving battalions isolated in pockets of resistance, surrounded by snow and enemies. Supplies, already scarce since the rainy autumn that had turned roads into swamps, now arrived in dribs and drabs. Luftwaffe Junkers, U-52 planes, battling Arctic winds, dropped packages that often landed in Soviet territory, gifting the enemy with German ammunition. Starving soldiers scoured devastated villages for frozen potatoes or the meat of dead horses, cooking them over fires that attracted enemy artillery like moths to a flame. But soon these cracks widened into devouring abysses. In positions like Volokolamsk or Mozhaisk, where the Germans had dug shallow trenches, mere furrows in the frozen ground, for the earth was as hard as iron, the Soviet assault broke through with a ferocity that dismantled any illusion of defense. Imagine a German company, reduced to half its original strength by casualties and desertions, trying to repel a fresh Soviet division. The Reds advanced under cover of snow, their white uniforms making them invisible until the last moment, when they emerged shouting, firing with PPSH-41 submachine guns that spat bullets in incessant bursts. The Germans, with Kar-98K rifles that required manual reloading after each shot, fired until the last cartridge, but the cold made their hands tremble, their weapons jam, and panic set in. "Retreat! Retreat!" officers shouted, ordering a withdrawal, but the retreat turned into a stampede, men slipping on the blood-soaked snow, stumbling over the bodies of comrades, leaving behind heavy machine guns they couldn't carry. The physical collapse was horrific, but the emotional one was an abyss of pure terror. Soldiers who had believed in Aryan racial superiority now faced reality. The subhuman Slav, as Nazi propaganda labeled them, proved resilient, numerous, and ruthless. In the trenches, fear manifested itself in uncontrollable tremors, not only from the cold, but from the certainty of imminent death. Nights were tormented by nightmares, visions of Soviet tanks crushing bunkers, of bayonets tearing through entrails, of partisans dragging prisoners into dark forests where unimaginable tortures awaited. Despair spread like a plague. Unsent letters piled up, filled with final confessions to mothers and wives speaking of hunger, that gnawed at their stomachs like acid, of wounds that festered without remedy, of lost friends whose bodies lay unburied, devoured by hungry crows. Officers, pressured by Hitler's orders forbidding retreats, the famous stand or die, executed deserters in summary executions, but this only fueled terror, transforming the army into a cold prison where death at the hands of the enemy seemed preferable to the bullet of a comrade. Panic, that primal demon, finally shattered the legendary German. Discipline. In battles like Tula or Klin, Soviet units flanked German lines, cutting escape routes and creating cauldrons of death. Wehrmacht soldiers, finding themselves surrounded, abandoned valuable equipment. Panzer III tanks bogged down without fuel, Pak 38 cannons pointed to the sky in silent surrender, trucks set ablaze to deny the enemy, sending plumes of smoke that painted the sky black, like souls ascending to hell. Men ran en masse, tears freezing on their bearded faces, shouting in German mixed with hastily learned Russian pleas, "Nicht schießen, Kamerad! Don't mess with me, comrade!" Some, driven mad by terror, shot themselves to avoid capture, fearing the Soviet prisoner of war camps where hunger and forced labor awaited. The collapse was visible. Divisions like the 2nd Panzer, which had once seen the Kremlin towers in the distance, now shrank to fractions of their former strength, with survivors dragging themselves westward, carrying the wounded on makeshift sleds, while the Red Army pursued them, reclaiming territory with a vengeance that echoed centuries of past invasions, from Napoleon to now Hitler. In this chaos, the war became a fight for mere survival, where the pride of the Reich evaporated like snow in the sun. The Germans, once hunters, now the hunted, looked back with haunted eyes, awaiting the next red wave that would engulf them. Terror was omnipresent. Howling winds that seemed to whisper prophecies of doom, snows that buried the abandoned, wounded alive, and an oppressive silence broken only by distant explosions. Despair took deep root. The belief in final victory, in the promised Wunderwaffe, crumbled before the vastness of Russia, where millions more could be mobilized. The Eastern Front, at this pivotal moment, marked not only a tactical defeat, but the birth of an eternal nightmare for Nazi Germany, that of a prolonged, bloody, inexorable war, where the collapse of the Wehrmacht was merely the prelude to greater horrors, such as Stalingrad and Kursk. But here, at the gates of Moscow, fate was sealed in ice and blood, echoing history's eternal warning. Pride precedes a fall, and the Russian winter devours the arrogant. Ah, what a sublime and terrifying transformation was taking place across the vast snowy fields of central Russia in the dark heart of December 1941, when the Soviet counterattack, initially timid and hesitant like the first snowflakes of a snowstorm, erupted into a primal force, a human avalanche that swallowed everything in its path with a fury that seemed to defy the laws of nature and war. It was as if the Russian land itself, wounded and outraged by the Nazi invasion, had awakened from an ancestral slumber, summoning its children to a cosmic vengeance, where the cold was not an enemy, but an ally forged in the steel of hardened souls. The Red Army, composed of a living tapestry of steppe peasants, Magnitogorsk factory workers, Leningrad intellectuals, and Siberian warriors, transferred. From the Japanese borders, now united in a chorus of collective rage, fueled by the fresh memory of German atrocities. entire villages incinerated in devouring flames, civilians shot in mass graves that filled with frozen blood, and the imminent threat to sacred Moscow, the beating heart of Rodina. Under the command of visionary generals like Georgy Zhukov, who orchestrated the offensive with the precision of a maestro conducting a symphony of destruction, and Konstantin Rokossovsky, whose Siberian divisions arrived like divine reinforcements, the attack gained momentum, transforming from mere tactical pushes into an unstoppable red tide, a wave of humanity that swept across the white horizon with an intensity that made the air tremble. Imagine the scene, painted in the icy hues of winter twilight, where the setting sun tinged the snow a bloody pink, as if foreshadowing the spill of lives to come. Soviet soldiers, once entrenched in defensive positions around Moscow, emerging from holes dug in the ice, their padded coats covered in frost that glistened like malevolent diamonds. They had suffered the unspeakable hunger that gnawed at their insides like ravenous rats, cold that penetrated their bones like invisible blades, and losses that left irreparable gaps in the ranks, with fallen comrades freezing in place, their rigid bodies serving as macabre markers on the battlefield. But now, with supplies arriving from the Ural factories, newly produced tanks, ammunition piled into wagons that cut through the Siberian vastness, a primal energy possessed them. It was no longer a calculated march, guided by maps and clocks. It was a frenzied race, an ecstasy of fury, where despair transmuted into absolute power. Orders echoed through the lines, short and imperious like whips in the wind. Advance! No mercy for the fascists, for Stalin, for our mothers and children, for every drop of Russian blood spilled. And the men responded with a collective roar, "Ura!" a cry that rose to the heavens like a warrior's prayer, instilling terror in enemy hearts miles away. The wind, that treacherous ally of the Russian winter, howled with supernatural force, pushing the Soviet troops forward as if Boreas himself, god of the boreal winds, had allied himself with the Red Corps, carrying snowflakes that blinded the Germans while propelling the attackers forward. Each step left deep impressions on the icy crust, not mere footprints, but testimonies of an inexorable march. Dark, blood gushing from newly opened wounds, sweat that instantly froze into salt crystals, and debris abandoned along the way, such as captured German rifles, crushed helmets, and fragments of vehicles that looked like the bones of extinct dinosaurs. The Soviets advanced in successive waves, divisions like the 1st Guard Shock Army and the 16th Army, composed of hundreds of thousands of hardened souls, running through the deep snow on makeshift skis or Valenki boots that kept them floating above the white chaos. Their faces, scarred by frostbite and fierce determination, reflected an ancient rage, echoing past invasions, from Napoleon in 1812, whose legions were devoured by the same General Winter, to the medieval Teutonic Knights crushed on the frozen plains. Now, the attack was a red tsunami, a flood of khaki uniforms and scarlet flags fluttering in the wind, where military discipline merged with the savage instinct for survival and revenge. And then, the tanks entered the scene. Oh, what? A vision of primal terror. The T-34s, those Soviet steel colossi, emerged from the blizzards like prehistoric beasts awakened from a millennia-long slumber, their hulls covered in layers of ice that cracked with every movement, engines roaring at the limit of human mechanics, wide tracks crushing everything in their path, frozen bodies of German soldiers, makeshift barricades of logs and compacted snow, and even bogged-down enemy panzers, whose cannons became useless in the relentless cold. Designed with sloped armor that deflected projectiles, as if they were stones hurled against a mountain, these tanks, mass-produced in the factories of Kharkiv and Stalingrad, even under constant bombardment, advanced in formation, their turrets rotating with lethal precision, spitting fire from 76 millimeter cannons that pulverized German positions in explosions of frozen earth and metallic shrapnel. Soviet crews, composed of young mechanics and hardened veterans, shouted orders within the claustrophobic confines, feeling the vehicle as an extension of their bodies, an embodiment of collective fury. Germany was no longer facing mere soldiers. It was facing the distilled essence of an entire people, millions mobilized by Stalin's call in November 1941, when military parades in Moscow inspired the nation to rise up against the invader, transforming civilians into warriors overnight. On the opposite side, terror settled like an invisible plague in the hearts of the Wehrmacht, those once invincible. Masters of Europe, now reduced to trembling ghosts in makeshift trenches, barely warmed by weak fires that barely melted the ice on their torn boots. Their lines, stretching for hundreds of kilometers from the gates of Moscow to the forests of Vyazma, initially yielded with agonizing slowness, like rotten wood creaking under pressure, each trench defended tooth and nail by exhausted men whose stomachs rumbled with hunger and whose minds clouded with visions of imminent death. Ammunition was scarce, cartridges counted one by one, grenades saved for the last gasp, and supplies were disrupted by partisans who sabotaged railways and ambushed convoys, leaving the Germans at the mercy of the cold that froze lubricating oils and caused machine guns to jam at crucial moments. Officers like Friedrich Paulus and Heinz Guderian, whose personal diaries overflowed with despair, ordered fierce resistance, but panic spread. Soldiers saw Soviet hordes appearing on the horizon, an indistinct mass of figures running, screaming, shooting, as if hell itself had opened up and vomited out its legion. And then came the cruel moment of epiphany, when the Germans realized, with a chill that transcended physical cold, that they were not losing an isolated battle, but being swallowed by a force greater than any human strategy. Each hill recaptured, like the elevations around Solnechnogorsk, where Soviets scaled icy slopes under crossfire. Each road recovered, like the Moscow-Leningrad highway, now free. For the flow of Red reinforcements, each warehouse looted and each ruin buried in snow became prophetic symbols. The war had turned, the momentum lost forever, and winter, that merciless judge, had chosen its side, favoring those born in its clutches. The Germans, stumbling in disorderly retreats, felt despair corroding their souls. Visions of distant families in bombed-out Germany, dreams of quick victory evaporating like smoke, and the terror of being surrounded, as in the pockets of Klin and Tula, where entire divisions were annihilated or captured, prisoners marching east in endless columns, facing gulags where death by starvation and forced labor awaited. From that point on, the pace of the war no longer belonged to the Wehrmacht. Its Blitzkrieg tactics now obsolete in the frozen swamp, it was the Red Army that dictated fate, advancing with a determination bordering on the divine, reclaiming kilometers a day in an offensive that stretched from Kalinin in the north to Tula in the south. Like a true avalanche, initiated by a simple snow displacement but growing in mass and speed until it became uncontrollable, the Soviet counterattack would not stop. Not until the German forces were crushed under its inexorable march, leaving behind a trail of abandoned vehicles, stiff bodies, and a lesson etched in the ice. Russia does not surrender, it devours. German terror was palpable, a veil of despair enveloping every soldier. Nightly whispers of Die Russen kommen, the Russians are coming, echoes of Katyusha artillery howling like banshees, and the certainty that the Eastern Front had become a bottomless abyss where survival was a fleeting miracle. In this vortex of fury and cold, history was rewritten, marking the beginning of the Nazi decline. A human avalanche that would sweep all the way to Berlin years later, but whose roots sank into that winter of 1941, where fear was immortalized in every snowflake tinged with red. And so, when the last echo of artillery dissolves in the icy wind, we understand the true magnitude of that campaign. The snow was not just a backdrop, it was the weapon, the judge, and the executioner. The Red Army, once cornered and bleeding, is reborn in the heart of winter and pushes the enemy back step by step, shot by shot, life for life. The Wehrmacht, which believed itself to be unbeatable, discovers its limit in that white desert. The cold froze weapons, broke machines, and above all, destroyed the will to move forward. There, on roads buried by snowfall, the myth of German invincibility was shattered, not by speeches, but by sacrifice, determination, and the brutal force of nature. From that moment on, the war would never be the same again. The Eastern Front transforms from a German nightmare into Soviet hope, and the world, watching from afar, finally realizes that the Nazi advance was not inevitable. The battle did not end the war, but it showed that it could be won. It showed that the courage of ordinary men fighting for their land and survival could defeat the most powerful machine on the planet. In the end, winter erased all tracks in the snow, but it did not erase what had been achieved. There, buried beneath ice and blood, emerged the first sign of what was to come. Stalingrad, Kursk, the triumphant return to Berlin. It was in that deadly cold that the fate of World War II began to change. When nature itself rose up and cried out to the world, "Here, Germany stops. From now on, Russia wins." What begins as a retreat turns total collapse. Wehrmacht soldiers no longer obey orders. They obey only the primal instinct to survive. The collapse doesn't happen in a single moment. It spreads like cracks in thin ice. Initially, the officers try to maintain discipline. Hold your position, retreat is prohibited. But the words are lost in the icy wind. Communication fails, radios freeze, cables break, messengers freeze to death before reaching their destination. The units are starting to disappear, not because they are annihilated in battle, but simply because cease to exist. Platoons dissolve in the blizzard. Hungry men abandon their posts and seek shelter in ruined houses, the walls protecting them only from the soul-crushing wind. Others bury themselves in makeshift holes, hoping for dawn, but discovering that dawn brings only more snow, more death. And when the Soviets arrive, they find no organized resistance. They find shadows of an army. German tanks stop in the middle of the roads, frozen like unintentional monuments, gears jammed by ice, crews killed without a single shot being fired, suffocated by the cold inside steel hulls that had become coffins. Hunger is as brutal as the enemy. Soldiers tear chunks out of frozen rations, chipping their teeth. Some people cook dirty snow to wet their tongues and trick their bodies. And others, in their worst moments, dream of food while the ice consumes their flesh. Morale falls like bodies on the white floor. No speech, no order, no map can save what is already destroyed. And so, the empire that marched across Europe with roaring engines and waving flags now crawls, invisible in the snow, drowned by his own ambition. The German front, once a wall of steel, becomes a labyrinth of frozen ghosts, while the Red Army advances like a predator that smells blood. The battle turned into a massacre. And Winter, this silent judge, he continues swinging his hammer. As Soviet troops advance, something even more terrifying happens. They don't just attack, they surround. The Red Army has mastered the art of entrapment. On maps covered in snow and blood, Soviet arrows curve behind German lines, like claws closing in on exhausted prey. The result is devastating. Entire groups of the Wehrmacht, once confident, now realize they are trapped. No escape routes, out of supplies, no reinforcements. Hopeless. For many German soldiers, the worst discovery is not seeing the Soviets ahead. It's realizing that there's no more backup. Roads that should have provided evacuation routes are blocked by Soviet columns emerging from the snowstorm, like red shadows from another world. The fog itself freezes the air and distorts vision. Soldiers hear tanks before they see them, feeling the ground tremble beneath their frozen feet. With each passing hour, the enclosed pockets get smaller. We're running out of ammunition. Machine guns rust in the ice. The rifles fail, soldiers break ice to fill canteens and ration ammunition as if it were gold. And the Red Army tightens its grip. Soviet artillery, buried behind snowy hills and forests, fires mercilessly. Explosions send up clouds of snow, mixed with dirt and pieces of men. Each impact is like a hammer striking the wall of a castle about to collapse. The Germans are fighting with everything they have, not through victory, but by existence. And yet, every battle is lost before it even begins. There is no quick retreat in deep snow. There is no refuge. When the enemy is in every direction, inside the pockets, officers try to maintain discipline, but their shouts are drowned out by explosions and the howling wind. Each man's uniform becomes nothing more than a soaked rag, clinging to his skin from the ice and fear. For many, the siege means a slow death. For others, it signifies the final act, the moment they stand up. They throw away everything that's left. They scream until their throats burn, and they tumble into the snow, swallowed by the endless white. Outside, the Soviets are advancing relentlessly. Winter closes the door. The Red Army locks from the inside, and no one escapes. When the sieges close in and all hope vanishes in the icy wind, something previously unthinkable happens among the German soldiers. The word surrender ceases to be taboo and becomes a survival instinct. But this surrender is not quick. It grows slowly, like ice accumulating on the roof until it collapses. First, the men try to resist. The proud. Wehrmacht is not trained to raise white flags. They keep fighting, even when their pockets are empty and they run out of bullets. But winter is an enemy that never sleeps, and each new dawn brings bodies hardened as stone. In abandoned huts, groups of German soldiers huddle together, trying to steal human warmth. Fire is a rare luxury, often impossible because the smoke gives away your positions. And then, in the dark, in the silence, they ask themselves, whispering, why continue? Foxholes turn into shallow graves. Officials tear up maps that no longer make sense. The cut phone lines silence any hope of salvation. When Soviet tanks appear on the horizon, nobody is surprised. They were expected, just like death itself. The Red Army arrives, not like a weary army, but like a tide rejuvenated by the certainty of victory. And then finally, bodies trembling with cold drop their rifles, hands raised, faces burned by the wind, empty eyes. This is not a theatrical surrender. There are no pretty white flags nor speeches. There are only exhausted men kneeling in the snow. Some cry, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion from fighting against a fate already sealed. Others, rigid as frozen statues, simply stare at the ground, accepting that the great army that once conquered half of Europe is now reduced to prisoners huddled beneath blizzards that streak across the sky. And the cruelest thing of all, not everyone can give up. The snow swallows many before they have a chance to raise their hands. Thus, when Soviet soldiers round up thousands of prisoners, they do not see organized armies. They see torn coats, boots falling apart, useless weapons, living ghosts staggering around. The Wehrmacht reached its limit, and the limit was broken. Between steel and ice, winter doubles German pride, and the Red Army, driven by vengeance and survival, reaps the consequences. When the fighting subsides and the sound of weapons finally fades, the landscape reveals what the chaos had been concealing, a desert of white death. The wind blows fiercely, raising clouds of loose snow, and each gust exposes or conceals bones, bodies, tank hulls, and men who will never again answer to orders. At first glance, it's difficult to distinguish snow from meat. Whiteness covers everything. Unclaimed helmets stand out like small, grey islands. Broken rifles rise from the snow like makeshift crosses. The front that once advanced proudly towards Moscow now lies motionless, frozen in time. Each fallen soldier is a story enclosed in silence. Letters never sent, promises never kept, dreams interrupted by a bullet or an unforgiving cold. For the Soviets walking among the ruins, the scene is both triumph and trauma. They win, but they march among the dead, and they know that many are their own. The Red Army also left its ghosts there, men who advanced and never returned, hastily buried under mounds of snow, with bayonets hastily marking the spot where they rest. There are no official cemeteries. The frozen ground is too hard to dig in. Thus, the ice becomes a shroud for thousands. The dead horses, silent allies of logistics, become grotesque statues hardened in the place where they fell, their bellies ripped open by the cold or the metal. Burned tank carcasses slowly smoke, as if breathing, and the snow, tinged red, creates frozen rivers of blood, a macabre art painted by war. The silence that follows is deafening. No screaming, no engine, no controls. Only the wind, whistling through the empty helmets. The Soviet victory is there, but buried under layers of sacrifice. And for every soldier who survives, the memory of what was seen never fades. The battlefield ceases to be territory, and it becomes a collective tomb, where winter writes its epitaph. Here ambition died frozen, and as the Red Army advances toward its next objective, the snow covers everything again, as if trying to erase any trace of the carnage. But nothing can erase what happened there. The ground is marked forever, and when the ice finally melts, it will tell stories that no movie, no book, and no survivor will ever forget. If before the Reich soldiers marched with their chins held high, confident in the power of their Blitzkrieg, after this campaign in the ice, everything changes, profoundly. What falls on the battlefield is not just blood. The illusion crumbles. The Wehrmacht swept across half of Europe, crushing armies, breaking nations, and collecting victories as trophies. For many, it was impossible to imagine that she could be stopped, much less defeated. But winter, the Red Army, and the physical and moral exhaustion itself impose a different reality. Within the German ranks, the stories once told around military campfires of rapid advance, dominance, and precision are now replaced by somber whispers. The Russians don't stop. They come with the cold. It's impossible to fight against the land and against the climate. What was once arrogance has turned into fear. Strategic plans lose their effectiveness when the men who should be executing them no longer believe in them. Soldiers are beginning to realize that they are not marching toward final victory. They march into a gigantic, icy country determined to destroy them. The army that once intimidated the world is beginning to show its weariness. Heavy boots, empty stairs, the weight of friends buried under ice. On the other side of the front, among the Soviets, the effect is the opposite. That victory, snatched from the most brutal cold, achieved when all seemed lost, ignites something powerful, a flame of collective trust. The same men who retreated in panic in 1941 now raise their heads, grip their rifles, and say to each other, "They might bleed. We can win. Mother Russia is alive." This change is the prelude to what comes next, because wars aren't won with tanks and cannons alone. They are overcome by morality, and at this moment the scales finally tip. On the world map, Allied generals watch from the other side of Europe, receiving reports. German divisions destroyed, exhausted troops pushed back a war machine that is beginning to rust, and they realize the Nazi giant may fall. In summary, winter took away from the Germans not only soldiers, took off a myth. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the world is witnessing something unimaginable happen. The Wehrmacht retreats, bleeding, it weakens, and the Red Army, hardened by the cold and fueled by revenge and survival, discovers the taste of victory. It's the psychological shift that changes everything. The war is not over, but its axis has shifted, and that moment, buried in snow and blood, will echo all the way to Berlin. The battle comes to an end, but the icy wind continues to blow as a reminder of all that was lost and all that was gained. What began as Germany's proud eastward advance becomes the turning point of the war, turn of direction. And it's not just the Red Army that's leading this turnaround. It's the Russian winter itself, indomitable and impartial, who decides to fight, the enemy that no one has defeated. The Wehrmacht faced armies and won. He confronted countries and crushed them. But there, in that vast white sea of ice, snow-capped mountains, and temperatures below what a human being can imagine, she found an enemy who could not shoot, surround, or stop. The cold slowly tortures. It doesn't explode. It destroys from the inside. It freezes. The steel hardens the blood, extinguishes the will, and it was there in that endless blizzard that German ambition finally crumbled. The Red Army, reborn for the Soviets, every victory wrested from the snow is more than just a territorial conquest. It is revenge for cities burned, families devastated, troops killed in the wheat fields of the previous summer. Men who had lost everything recover what no one can take away: hope. With each kilometer reclaimed, they leave behind deep marks, pits filled with dead enemies, trails of destroyed tanks, and red flags waving over frozen ruins. The message is clear: Russia will not fall. Consequences that echo. The world quickly realizes what this moment means. Germany won't win quickly. The Eastern Front is a bottomless abyss. Time, weather, and the scale of the war are now working against the Reich. And within the corridors of Nazi power, the most dangerous poison is born: doubt. Doubt creates cracks. The cracks are getting bigger, and years later they will bring down the empire that Hitler believed to be invincible, because after that brutal campaign, the Wehrmacht would never be the same again. The storm that decides history. As the last shots echo and the smoke from the artillery dissipates in the wind, the snow begins to fall again. Slowly, silently, indifferently. It covers bodies, tanks, trench holes, turn off stuck ones, and it returns to the front its deadly silence. But beneath that white cloak lies the truth that will change the course of humanity. Winter has chosen a side, and it has chosen Russia, and by crushing Germany in that frozen landscape, it paved the way for everything that would come after: Stalingrad, Kursk, the westward advance, and the siege of Berlin. The war didn't end there, but there, for the first time, the end became possible.